preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I might begin with a statement that might seem paradoxical only in retrospect. What I'm trying to say is that 19th century Europeans often envied, often feared, ridiculed or hated Germans, but only Jews seemed actually to have truly loved them. This was true not only of the Jews in Germany or Austria, but throughout Eastern Europe. In Germany, their overriding ambition was to be complete Germans. A great many of them, I think, succeeded in this task. Freud famously reminded a German audience in Frankfurt that Jews had been living in the Rhineland long before those who later called themselves Germans came there. In the 19th century, they had reason to regard themselves almost as an ancient Germanic tribe, like the Saxons or Bavarians who came into being as ethnic entities only several centuries later. If, in retrospect, all of this appeared later as a terrible illusion, it was a highly creative one, and with a grandeur and a tragic irony of its own. It is the wrenching story of a minority, a tiny minority of less than 1%, in a place at a moment in time that still bears urgently on our own. Tolerance, I think, remains the essential ennobling project of modernity. It is not surprising that German history in recent years, unlike English or French history, is nowadays often told mostly in retrospect. It is told backwards, so to speak, and focuses on Hitler's Third Reich. The Third Reich overshadows everything. This is, of course, understandable. What happened was so unprecedented, so mind-boggling, so terrible. Historians are still mostly searching for clues to explain the catastrophe that followed. Instead, in this book, I begin in 1743 with a 14-year-old boy named Moses Mendelssohn, a native of Dessau, a city of some 100 miles southeast of Berlin. I begin with this boy who trudges, probably barefoot, through the so-called Rosenthaler Gate, the only gate in the Berlin Wall reserved by law for the transit of Jews, oxen, and other beasts. The boy was a hunchback. He suffered from a bad case of stuttering. The gatekeeper's surviving log for that day includes the notation, and I quote, "Today there passed 6 oxen, 7 swine, and a Jew." And the book ends 2 centuries later with Hannah Arendt, who after a brief incarceration in a German prison, boards a night train in exactly the opposite direction in the hope of reaching the Czech border, which, since she had no passport, she hoped to cross clandestinely. Now, several versions of what transpired during Mendelssohn's interrogation at the gate have been passed on. According to one, the gatekeeper teased the young hunchback, suspecting him of being another peddler. Peddling was banned in the city. He cries, "Jew, what are you peddling? I may buy something from you." Mendelssohn is said to have responded, "You'll never want to buy anything from me. The gatekeeper insisted, "Out with it, tell me what you deal in." The boy stuttered back, "I deal in reason." According to another version, he said, "I want to learn." Both versions are probably apocryphal, but as such anecdotes often do, they summed up the main facts of the case. Mendelssohn's passage from Dessau to Berlin was like through a time machine, from the hermetic insularity of the medieval ghetto to the relative enlightenment of 18th century Berlin. For his later achievements as a philosopher and a religious reformer, he would be hailed as the German Socrates or as the Jewish Luther. For his advocacy of an enlightened secular state, Mirabeau would place him on the same pedestal as the authors of the American Constitution. Throughout the 19th century, German Jews vicariously enjoyed Mendelssohn's famous friendships with leading German writers and scholars. Their pride in these friendships was indicative of, and perhaps eased, their own difficulty to win a similar degree of acceptance. He became their, how shall I put it, patron saint. He was a model for Orthodox and Reformed, as well as for free thinkers, all who sought to preserve their identity but share in the general culture. Mendelssohn wanted them to breach the cultural and social confines of the ghetto, which in the Age of Enlightenment were beginning to be self-imposed. What Mendelssohn meant in his time, what in a way he still means today, can be gleaned in a recent post-war German historical and literary guidebook to the city of Berlin. I ran into it accidentally while researching this book in the Prussian archives. This guidebook goes as far as claiming that apart from the modest attempts of a few minor forgotten German poets, and of course the founding of the Prussian Academy of Science by Leibniz in 1695, the history of literature of Berlin, I quote, begins on an autumn day in 1743 when a 14-year-old Talmudic student named Mendelssohn entered the city through the gate reserved strictly for cattle and Jews. End of quote. This book is a collective biography of sorts. It's a thick braid made of many personal strands. The world, I think, is famously made up of stories, and the rest is history. I was looking for these stories. I tried to gain the kind of knowledge that is of prime interest to both historians and novelists, a knowledge which, as Isaiah Berlin once put it, is more than the knowledge of a date, a figure, or a mere fact, and more like the knowledge of a character, a particular human face, a voice. History as it was spoken. History, after all, is first done orally. The written documents are often retrospective, apologetically. I was fascinated with certain 19th century secular German Jews, mostly writers, artists, scientists, journalists, politicians. The main thrust of their intellectual and political efforts was an attempt, a desperate attempt, to civilize German patriotism, to separate church and state, to base citizenship not on blood or law, promote what we would today call an open, multicultural society. I would go as far as saying that in their day, towards the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, German Jews were the flower of Europe. They may not have been typical German Jews. In a wider sense, however, they were emblematic. Historians and novelists can live with the unique. German Jews put their faith in the bourgeois Goethean ideal of high culture. They didn't always have the good press they have today. There was a time when the opposite was true. They were decried as self-hating Jews who for decades had allegedly lived a lie. Some even insinuated that they had deserved their fate. Even Hannah Arendt, in one of her first essays after arrival in America, sketched the cruel caricature of a certain Herr Kuhn from Berlin, a proverbial self-hater. With him, she insisted, every history of German Jews must start, nothing less. This alleged prototype, she wrote, had always been 150% German. The Nazis kicked him out of Germany. He found refuge in Czechoslovakia and promptly became a 150% Czech patriot. Ousted from Czechoslovakia, he became a 150% Austrian jingoist. Forced out of Austria, he became 150% French, and so on and so on. He could never make up his mind as to what he was. I'm quite sure that Hannah Arendt was soon sorry for this silly caricature. Ironically, by the way, only 2 decades later, Arendt would bitterly regret that there weren't more German Jews in Israel to counterbalance, as she put it, the influx of Polish or primitive Arab Jews there. The latter, the primitive Arab Jews, she insinuated in a letter to the German philosopher Karl Jaspers, are capable of every possible monstrosity. And funnily enough, Jaspers sheepishly responds, yes, you're right. Let's hope the German Jews gain the upper hand. Now, the tide in Israel has since changed. In Israel, where in the late 19th century a well-known Labour Party leader still complained that German Jewish immigrants worried more about Palestinian than about Israeli human rights, in that Israel they are now the subject of sympathetic and at times admiring books, novels, and films. And in Germany, needless to say, after the Second World War, they continue to be the subject of a nostalgic academic cottage industry. Now, many of the men and women I wrote about were assimilated, or as sometimes is said, acculturated, though neither term reflected the complexity of a predicament that finally became a kind of identity. I took as my guideline Jean-Paul Sartre's definition: Jews are those considered by others as Jews, irrespective of their religious or ethnic allegiance. It could be said about many assimilated German Jews what was said about Ludwig Bamberger, for example, the Jewish patriotic hero of the 1848 uprising, that they were less children of the synagogue than of the Enlightenment. The history of assimilation, I think, still remains a fascinating subject. It still remains to be written, in fact, and perhaps it never will be. In some eyes, it's almost a subversive subject. Assimilationists have avoided it because they don't want to draw attention to themselves, and the Zionists, for equally self-interested reasons, gave it a rather one-sided interpretation. As I've said before, shortly before the deluge, German Jews were the secular flower of Europe. Their true home was German culture and language. Heinrich Heine was one of the first to realize this. His true fatherland, he wrote, was the German language, and I quote, our most sacred possession, a fatherland even for him who is denied one by malice or folly. He wrote these lines in 1820 after a few months after witnessing an attempted anti-Semitic riot in Hamburg. Heine's life was a Bildungsroman on its own, the roman of perhaps the most gifted, most beloved German poet after Goethe, a Jew and a German, ambivalent, creatively ambivalent about both. It is fascinating to this day to explore the plots and subplots of this life and that of so many others like him. Accepted or rejected, German Jews continued to potter with their identity, inventing, suppressing, professing, or rediscovering it. Contrary to the rumor, the vast majority never hid the fact that they were Jews. There were long intervals in Germany when this forthright approach was no impediment to integration. A great many intermarried. The rate of intermarriage in Germany anticipated by more than half a century the rate of intermarriage today in the United States, though I doubt that mixed couples in Germany were married jointly by a priest and a rabbi, as so often happens today in the US. Tens of thousands converted. In many cases, they didn't disappear within the majority. Family links remained more powerful than religion. For example, Karl Marx's family converted to Christianity, but continued to attend Sabbath Eve dinners like this one at the home of Karl Marx's uncle, who happened to be the chief rabbi of Mainz. In most cases, conversions were purely pragmatic, a formality designed to promote or facilitate a career. Converts followed the same impulse that makes many ambitious young men and women today all over the world learn to speak English at considerable more cost and effort. Still others were secularists, or like Franz Rosenzweig, who in a marvelous act of self-invention, on the eve of a planned conversion to Christianity, returned to Judaism and became perhaps the most important Jewish religious thinker of the 20th century. Others, like Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism and an ardent admirer of Bismarck and all things German, became a Jewish nationalist. With few exceptions, as I've said, the main thrust of their intellectual and political efforts was an attempt to civilize German patriotism. There was perhaps only one occasion when German Jewish intellectuals briefly abandoned this noble effort and joined in the jingoism of most other Europeans on the eve and during the first few months of the First World War. The First World War, as you will remember, was the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. As George Kennan once put it, without the First World War, Nazism and communism might never have seized power in Germany or Russia. There has rarely been a confluence of two cultural, ethnic, or religious traditions that proved so richly creative at its peak and so deadly in the end. Friedrich Grunfeld, in his book Prophets Without Honor, a background to Freud, Kafka, Einstein, and their world, a book quite popular about 30 or 40 years in America, wrote that had the end not been so awful, we would now hail the Weimar period as a, quote, golden age, second only to the Italian Renaissance. In literature alone, German Jews accounted for such luminaries as Heine, Kafka, Wörfel, Stefan and Arnold Zweig, Wassermann, Feuchtwanger, Volkskehl, Hermann Broch and Karl Kraus. I list only the best known. in literature. In the sciences, Willstätter, Fritz Haber, the man who, during the First World War, saved Germans from starvation, Ehrlich, Einstein, and of course Freud. In music, there were Mahler, Kurt Weill, Schönberg, and of course Mendelssohn's grandson, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy. Given the German Jews' relatively late entry into European civilization, the wealth and variety of their contribution to the arts and sciences was simply startling. In politics, they were midwives or founders of most German political parties. As political activists, most were prominent on the liberal or radical left. As voters, they mirrored the most enlightened sections of the rising German bourgeoisie and tended to support the liberal center and the moderate left. Early on, interestingly, the German philosopher Herder had anticipated their liberalizing influence. Long before they were emancipated and given the vote, Herder predicted that they would have fewer or none of the prejudices that other Germans usually cast off with so much difficulty. As social and political critics, a few were sometimes impertinent, unmindful that stepchildren must always be on their best behavior, yet their constantly precarious situation induced many to cultivate a skepticism and a sense of irony and bitter humor that became almost their hallmark. They were not better or wiser men and women, of course, than others. But as liberals and as militants of a more tolerant society, in many cases they really acted simply in self-interest. Their prominence as entrepreneurs in so many fields, far beyond their share in the population, resembled that of other minorities. That of, for example, the Scots in Great Britain, or the Huguenots in Germany, or the Germans themselves in Eastern Europe, Russia and in the Baltic states, the Basques in Spain, the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Armenians in the Middle East and Europe. It was said of the Scots, if I'm not mistaken, that their philosophers, Hume or George Adam Smith, invented the modern world. German Jews occupied extraordinary vantage points from which they observed and, if need be, castigated the majority. They remained at the very heart of German culture and their own, scathing in their critique of German authoritarianism, but also of the foibles and failings and dogmatisms of their own ethnic and religious community. The major revolutions in European and American Jewish life during the 19th century, from the invention of religious reform to political Zionism, all originated in the German lands, among Jews passionately devoted to German culture. As their own tribal idols crumbled, they didn't simply borrow those of the Christian majority. They invented new ones: communism, psychoanalysis, and other systems based on the utopian conviction that the world could be rationally reordered and vastly improved on a quote-unquote scientific basis. Like Heine, the best among them tended to view their Jewish and their German identity with detached irony. The secularist Freud referred to Spinoza as his great brother in disbelief. There is the extreme case of Fritz Mautner, in his day perhaps the most famous European philologist, who echoed Durkheim's rash prediction at the time that all religions would soon die out. It's odd to read all this today. with fundamentalism on the rise nearly everywhere, except perhaps in Western Europe. One looks back today with astonishment to Mautner's famous announcement of 1890, and I quote, "The historical task of the Jews," he declared, "was once again to lead the world, this time as pioneers of modern godlessness." The links and the tensions between Jews and Germans were sometimes described as stemming from an alleged family resemblance. Heine hailed Jews and Germans as Europe's two ethical people. Together they would yet give birth to a new messianic age, nothing less. He went so far as to claim that the ancient Hebrews had been the Germans of the Orient. In our own time, the prominent American historian Gordon Craig spoke of a, quote, "striking resemblance between 19th century Germans and Jews, as evidenced by their industry, thrift, and a common proclivity for abstract speculation. A common respect for the written word," he wrote, "has made, quote, Jews the people of the book and Germans das Volk der Dichter und Denker, a people of poets and thinkers." Even when such generalizations contain a grain of truth, they never explained what later happened. There was also a lot of speculation on whether or not there had ever been a real dialogue between the two peoples, or even, as some put it, a symbiosis. Symbiosis was a very popular word in Germany before the rise of the Nazis. Much of this speculation was quite tedious. A dialogue, as you know, is possible only between individuals. Nations normally only scream or shoot at one another. The term symbiosis, borrowed from, of all things, biology, was especially dubious. In a symbiosis, one form of life is simply unable to exist without the other. Oddly enough, Martin Buber was one of the last to use this term. In his book, The End of the German-Jewish Symbiosis, an essay he wrote as late as 1939, he still rhapsodized about symbiosis. It had been abruptly interrupted, he wrote, by the Nazis, but it will soon be resumed again in the future. Before the Holocaust, it was mostly Jews who spoke hopefully of symbiosis. After the Holocaust, only penitent Germans evoked it, guilt-stricken and rueful over what they claimed their loss. Why has nobody ever spoken of a Jewish American or Dutch Jewish symbiosis? Now, there are no reliable early population statistics. In the 18th century, there can hardly have been more than 60,000 Jews in the German states, fewer than 0.5% of the overall German-speaking population. This exceedingly small, widely dispersed community was soon considerably augmented by the Jews of Silesia, Posen, and other largely Slavic territories conquered by Prussia in 3 successive wars. When in 1870, more than 30 independent German states consolidated under Bismarck to establish a united Reich, Jews were still an insignificant minority of slightly more than 1%. After 1870, even as Jewish immigration from the East continued, the percentage steadily declined with decreasing birth rates. 60 years later, on the eve of the Nazi takeover, when the total German population had risen to 65 million, their relative number had dropped to 0.8%. one still wonders how the presence of so tiny a minority could trigger, even indirectly, such dire consequences. Yet, as we have seen, in economic and cultural terms, there has rarely been an ethnic or religious minority so visible and, for better or worse, so magnified and often so overrated in the public mind on account of the relatively large number of successful artists, business entrepreneurs, writers, wits, scholars, and radical political activists. They were unusually conspicuous. They elicited envy and an almost pornographic curiosity. In the distorted mirrors of popular imagination, they often loomed ominously larger than their number, a presumed threat to national integrity, identity, culture, and the general well-being. The prominent role they played in German culture became fully appreciated for the first time only in retrospect. The full extent of their contribution was properly seen only after they were gone. Shortly after the Nazi takeover in 1933, in a last-minute attempt to diffuse Nazi hate propaganda, the traumatized leaders of the so-called Zentralverein, the most representative organization of German Jews, commissioned the compilation of a great encyclopedia of Jewish achievements in all fields, ranging from literature and the arts to Jewish and Christian theology, politics, warfare, industry, and the natural sciences. The result was entitled Jews in the Realm of German Culture. It was a vast, meticulously detailed encyclopedia of Jewish contributions to German life and culture during the previous 200 years. The task was completed with perhaps overwhelming Prussian thoroughness by a committee of experts headed by a well-known scholar. The oversized heavy book ran to 1,060 pages and comprised tens of thousands of entries and names. The introduction was by Richard Willstätter, the Nobel Prize winner in organic chemistry, who died shortly afterwards. To avoid possible misunderstandings, the book even included an appendix on non-Jews widely regarded as Jews, from Charlie Chaplin to Johann Strauss, Igor Stravinsky, and Albert Schweitzer. The Gestapo, of course, intervened and ordered the entire edition destroyed. The manuscript fortunately survived. It was reprinted after the war, oddly enough, by the West German Ministry of Education. A vast body of literature on this subject has since evolved, much of it in Germany. Germans continue to bemoan the incalculable loss Germans had inflicted, as it were, on themselves, as they put it. To readers of Kafka's famous novel, The Castle, this will sound ominously familiar. The Castle, as you will remember, is the haunting, or as we now say, Kafkaesque story of a surveyor named mysteriously K, who applies for permission to reside in a certain village. The castle keeps him waiting. The novel was a fragment and breaks off before K gets an answer to his plea. Max Brod, Kafka's friend and literary executor, claimed that Kafka had told him how he planned to end the book. Yes, the castle finally answers K's plea, but the permission arrives too late. It reaches K only as he lies dying. In conclusion, I must confess that one important insight voiced by others, perhaps better men, has escaped me. They claim to have discerned a pattern in German history preordained from the days of Luther to culminate in the Nazi Holocaust. According to this theory, German Jews were doomed from the outset. The end is said to have been as immutable as a law of nature. Such absolute certainties remain concealed from me. I found only a series of ups and downs, a succession of unforeseeable contingencies, none of which seem to have been inevitable. Alongside the Germany of antisemitism, there was another Germany of enlightened liberalism, political freedom, civilized rule of law, social security, and social democracy. Even Hitler's rise to power in January 1933 was not the result of overwhelming electoral successes. The Nazi share of the vote had even seriously declined in the fall of 1932. Rather, modern historians are almost unanimous. Hitler's triumph was the result of backstage machinations of conservative politicians and industrialists who overcame the hesitations of a senile president. They convinced him and themselves that they were hiring Hitler, as one of them wrote, hiring him to restore order and curb the trade unions. Installing Hitler as chancellor was not the only alternative at the time. Hindsight, I suggest, is not necessarily the best guide to understanding what really happened. The past is as often distorted as it is clarified by hindsight. The Nazi Holocaust was an earthquake that destroyed not only the topography, but the seismography as well, leaving us to wander dumbfounded in the ruins. Circular, self-fulfilling arguments are of little help in recovering the lost topography. Such arguments tend often to deflect backwards from the Holocaust to the Middle Ages to the 18th century, when Jews were beginning to trade, quote, their nationhood for the pottage of an illusory emancipation. From there, they plunge ahead to a seemingly preordained end. Accusations of self-hatred were frequently flung at assimilated German Jews, usually with scarce justification. In most cases, it was eminently possible to assimilate without hating yourself or despising one's roots. The history of the German Jews was much more than the history of a tragedy. It was also for a long time the history of an extraordinary success. We must understand the triumph, Fritz Stern, the leading American historian of German Jewry, has written. We must understand the triumphs in order to understand the tragedy. We must see the German Jews in the context of their time and at the very least appreciate the way they saw themselves and others, often with good reason. For long periods, they had cause to believe in their ultimate integration. It was touch and go almost to the end. As one contemplates this terrible story, one is seized with a sense of transience and precariousness of all human effort. We remember the losers because they touch our own wounds. And the line by Cato the Elder, whom Hannah Arendt often cited approvingly, comes to my mind, quote, "The victorious cause pleases the gods, but the defeated one pleases Cato." Thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be very glad to answer them.
Without any disrespect for enormous achievements of Jews during that period, or anything you said, there's some things in trouble. I mean, first of all, it seems highly unlikely. You suggest that at least either wishful thinking or not, you suggest it's true. The Jews that did the area before the German tribes, I would suggest the Eastern and Germanic tribes were in there shortly after the end of the Roman Empire, which was certainly before a large number of Jews were there. You suggest that a very tiny percent of Germans were Jews, but I think that it's true that a fairly substantial part of Berlin and large cities were Jews. You suggest that Kafka was German, and he wasn't. He was Czech, though his family spoke German. He was a relatively, to the extent he was patriotic or anything, he was a Czech. And you suggest that they invented what? Is there a question? Yeah. Well, that's fine. I'd like you to clear this up. I mean, you suggest that communism was invented by a Jew, presumably Karl Marx, but in fact, communism was spoken of in Greek literature. There were already communists in New England, in this country, that were successful.
Well, I think you are, in many of your remarks are perfectly true. It's only a question of the proportion and the weight that you give them. There were very few German Jews in Germany. That is,
What was the percentage in Berlin?
well, I gave the percentage. In the 18th century, there were less than 0.6%. Well, in the 19th century, their percentage declined. In Berlin, not, but in Germany.
What would you say is the role of Jews in Germany now?
It's hard to say. The Jews in Germany now are mostly non-German Jews, or the descendants of non-German Jews. It is true that the majority of Jews in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century were of Eastern European origins. That is to say, from those territories of Silesia and Posen that were annexed by the Germans under Frederick the Great. And they came from thoroughly Jewish, Yiddish-speaking communities. That is true.
Men and infants are not the only one that has that part of the tragedy born by the Jews was their desire, in fact, their success in integration in the German society, where it was a different situation than you had in Russia, where although you didn't have the Poles, they were allowed to leave because they were not in. They were considered necessary by the host country, the whole host country, because they were money lenders, and they performed many different functions that the native or the citizens of the country did not. But the Jews, by being integrated, were in positions that they did not want to leave. They were industrialists, they were in the middle and upper class, and didn't that contribute to the doom that they, until the end, they did not want to leave because they said, we are part of German society.
The tragedy was that they were. And this end was not inevitable. That is both the irony and the tragedy of the situation, and it's important to realize it. And in no other country in Europe or in the Americas was there such a confluence of currents and events that led to the rise of Nazism.
Compared to the beginning of the 20th century, it appears to me that there's very little cultural, scientific excitement coming out of Europe.
Out of Europe.
From Europe. And I am asking you if you would agree with me it's because today there are no Jews. It's a whole rebellion.
Well, there are plenty of Jews in America, and yet
What I'm saying is there is very little coming out of Europe in terms of the cultural excitement in the world than there was years ago before the Holocaust. And it appeared to be
Yeah.
because there are no Jews.
well, that's one possibility. It's true, but not necessarily the only. And we don't really know. Look, we don't really know what makes for a literary renaissance. We don't really know what the reasons for that. There was the great flowering of German letters in the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century in Germany, as there was in England 2 centuries earlier. These things are quite mysterious. There, as I said, there are millions of Jews in America, but I don't think that literature in America today is superior to European literature. In fact, they're both equally mediocre. And
I understand certainly you feel that the Holocaust is not inevitable, but somehow it seems to me there must be underlying.
there were underlying pressures, but the success of these pressures was not inevitable. There were other alternatives. It didn't have to happen.
Yeah, but I'm asking it the other way around.
Yes.
What were the problems that it all looked so good? Therefore, what was underlying that the Germans were able to take advantage of and turn it around?
But look, yes, there were these signs, but the odd thing was that antisemitism in France, for example, was much stronger than it was in Germany. And at the end of the 19th century, say during the Dreyfus affair, German Jews considered themselves lucky to be Germans.
But my question is, therefore, what was problematic that was not foreseen?
Well, nobody had foreseen the future, but it happened in Germany and not in France, where everybody expected it to happen. Sorry, I don't know. There are no, all these theories that explain historic events are speculations. They're sometimes right and they're very often wrong. We don't know. History is not an exact science. You cannot predict a historical process as you predict a chemical analysis.
If you follow the suggestion that the First World War was a pivotal thing, and indeed, because it left France and England with the complicity, if not the wish of the United States, left Germany in such a terrible financial condition
So,
The back of your book, this is really what the thing that intrigued me most about what Panthers book. In the back of the book, you say that you show how a small minority came to be perceived as a deadly threat to German national sovereignty. I was wondering if you could expand on that.
I'm sorry, what is the question?
But they were very small minorities. What was it in the psychology of the population of the larger and the culture of the community which translated that achievement of this very, very small group of people into a threat?
Well, yes, I wish I knew the exact chemical reason for that. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. I can only pinpoint both the irony and the tragedy. Sir?
Today that in Germany they tried so hard to explain or to at least talk about what was and attract Jews and publish things about what was.
Yes.
Do you think there's any kind of future really for Jewish, some other kind of Jewish success stories coming out of Germany?
It's very hard to say. The German Jewish population has grown considerably during the past 20 years, especially. Many of them are Russians. In fact, the vast majority of them are Russians. But they are not yet part of the German mainstream, and they're certainly not part of German culture or science or any other field. There isn't even not even in commerce or in business is there any Jew prominent today. In fact, there are no prominent German Jews in any fields, but this could change. We don't really know. I had a very funny experience in Hamburg. I went to I had a reading there from my book, and there were about 200 people in the hall. Most of them were Germans, not Jews, and but a dozen or two who stood up and asked questions did so in a thick Russian accent. And I noticed that they remarked with pleasure that they had such great ancestors like Heine and Freud and so on. They had not imagined that when they or their parents had taken them to Germany. It was a funny experience.
I'm sorry, I have to disagree. I grew up in Germany and I
Yes, yes.
Jewish family in Germany. The difference between Germany and the United States is you don't really carry your ethnicity or your religion on your sleeve. So
And in Germany you do?
no, you don't. Here you do much more.
Uh-huh.
So as an example, we're saying there are many Jews in German culture, but the first three concert masters, the Berlin Philharmonic, were all Jews. That was my German vocabulary. I'm sorry, what?
The present one is true.
Exactly. So there's Jewish doctors. I mean, I grew up in Berlin, there were 5,000 Jews, and wherever you went, you had Jews that were in prominent positions. We knew because we were Jewish, but maybe not everybody else knew that they were Jewish. So I think there's a difference. There is a huge presence. Jews can excel a lot in Germany the same way they did before.
I hope you're right. It could well be, but it hasn't happened so far. But
They're very present. They're very present.
yeah.
Quick question. Germanic tribes was downfall of Rome. Germanic tribes went into England and basically changed the look of England. Has it less to do with Judaism and more to do with the culture and the tribes that founded them?
Well, as you will have noticed from my remarks, I hesitate to make these generalizations about any ethnic group. Madam.
I'm not sure how to ask this, but do you think that there was something about what we could maybe call the German Jewish collective unconscious that allowed for them at that time to ignore what was going on around them?
No, it was their consciousness that allowed them to ignore what happened. But as I said, what happened did not have to happen. It could have been different. It's only in retrospect that they proved mistaken.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.